Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. This is Maria Brendelmeyer with Youth Power Learning. I'm a Senior Knowledge Management Specialist at Youth Power Learning here at Making Sense International, and welcome you all to this really important webinar about inclusive approaches for engaging youth with disabilities. And before we get into the main topic, let me just do a quick introduction about youth power learning, and especially about the positive youth development approach. Positive youth development is kind of the underlying philosophy that we are using on all the youth power projects and all the youth power activities. It means that we recognize the youth's inherent rights and in particular make sure that youth have assets, which is, for example, skills. We also want to make sure that youth can leverage those assets and therefore have the agency, that they have the ability to contribute to positive change either for themselves or for their communities, and also that they're surrounded by an enabling environment. So those four components, assets, agency, contribution, and enabling environment, are really at the basis of the positive youth development approach. And so Youth Power Learning is a 5-year-long project sponsored by USAID. And the main activities include the maintenance of the creation and running of a website called youthpower.org, where you can find resources, events, information, some what works documents that show what has worked in different sectors, in different areas of youth development. And you can also find an important document about measuring positive youth development. We have developed indicators, and then you can also contribute to the learning agenda. If you are already a member of our communities of practice, you will have learned about the learning agenda, and we will continue to involve you in that. And then you can join our communities of practice. We have 4 of them: youth in peace and security, gender and positive youth development, youth engagement, and cross-sectoral skills for youth. And it's the youth engagement community of practice champions that have organized this webinar today. And so with that, let me hand it over to who will introduce the community of practice.
Thanks, Maria. So as Maria shared, the Youth Engagement Community of Practice aims to provide a community where youth and youth-serving practitioners can come together to share ideas, resources, experiences, with the purpose of promoting meaningful youth engagement in all aspects of youth programming. Mike and I developed this focus as part of a year-long emphasis on engaging the most marginalized youth. So we've done an event on LGBTQI young people. We've looked at the impact of conflict and refugee youth. And we're excited to be learning a lot more about how we can more effectively engage young people with disabilities in our programs today. Before I turn it over to Mike, my co-champion, just a quick note that unfortunately our youth speaker from Rwanda, Bahati Sater Omar, had a health issue and is unable to join us this morning. But we will be hearing shortly from Phil Hanks, the International Program Manager at Leonard, Cheshire Disability. So thanks again for joining us, Phil, and thanks to everybody for being here. Mike?
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome to everybody. We're really happy to have you here with us today. So as Sarah and Maria have mentioned, today our topic is going to be focused on engaging young people with disabilities in international development programs. And this is, as Sarah mentioned, a part of our annual theme this year on inclusive youth engagement, or engaging diverse youth with a focus on the most vulnerable communities. This is drawing on some findings from the systematic review of positive youth development in low and middle income countries that was conducted by Youth Power in the past couple of years, which noted a lack of evidence on development outcomes for certain subgroups of youth who tend to be the most marginalized, including young women, sexual and gender minorities, and other populations. And so as part of this topic, earlier this year we have had activities on engaging LGBTI or sexual and gender minority youth, as well as on engaging refugee youth in development programs. And so this activity is meant to be another part of this series, and we're really excited about it. Just as a little bit of background on the topic, there are more than 1 billion people in the world with disabilities, which comprises about 15% of the world's population. And there are an estimated 220 million young people with disabilities, and an estimated 80% of those people are living in developing countries. So this is a really important demographic that we need to be talking about here when we talk about international development. Young people with disabilities are some of the most marginalized individuals in their societies, and so we really must more intentionally engage them in these programs to allow them to address and overcome barriers to their equal participation and growth in society. But this is, a really difficult and quite complex topic because youth with disabilities are not a monolithic block. There are many different types of disabilities. Some are visible and some are not, and they affect young people and their development in many different ways. And so this is sort of a tough topic to grapple with. And so today we'll be talking about engaging youth with disabilities in the programs that we all contribute to every day. And we'll have some particular focus on economic and workforce development, education programming, as well as advocacy for policy change to really try to create sustainable progress for greater equality for young people with disabilities. And so today we have Phil Hanks from Leonard, Cheshire Disability, which is an organization that delivers inclusive education and economic empowerment projects involving young people with disabilities. It also supports youth with disabilities to participate in politics and advocate for policies to advance their rights. And with that, I think I'll turn over to Sarah to introduce our speaker and moderate some of the discussion with Phil. And then we'll have a lively Q&A to fill up some of our extra time that we have today. So that'll hand it over to Sarah.
All right, great. Well, thanks a lot, Mike, for the framing. And Phil Hanks, as you mentioned, is the International Partnerships Manager at Leonard Cheshire Disabilities, based in the UK. And we're very, very thrilled to have him here to talk with us about some of their work and how some of the lessons that they're learning from their programs can be applied to our own. So with that, Phil, why don't you get started? Love to hear from you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sarah, Mike, and everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those joining online. It's a pleasure to be with you. As the introduction, perfect introduction, so you've gone through the first couple of slides, so I won't dwell on those. But yeah, just to clarify, I'm the International Partnerships Manager here at Leonard Cheshire, and my background is supporting youth volunteers internationally. And at the moment, I am managing a project to engage youth with disabilities in advocacy projects across Africa and Asia. I'll start off with the slides that I've put together. I'm not sure if I'm just having a quick look to see if I can flick through the slides. But I don't appear to have the forward and back buttons, I've just noticed, which were there a moment ago. I don't know if they can be changed remotely. Otherwise, I can just get going and we can take any questions at the end. But what I wanted to do was take the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what Leonard Cheshire is doing in terms of how it's engaging youth with disabilities, a little bit about the organisation, and then, as been previously mentioned, a little bit about how some of the learning and the research that we've been doing has been sort of factoring into how our programmes are evolving and how that could be useful for other organisations that are thinking to better engage youth with disabilities in their programming. So for those that are not so familiar with Leonard Cheshire, we're an organisation that works across the UK and internationally to support individuals to live, learn and work as independently as they choose, whatever their ability. Those eagle-eyed amongst you might have noticed that we've been through a brand refresh earlier this year. So we have some new bold colours and shapes with our organisation, and for those wanting to find out more, you can go to our website, leonardcheshire.org/international, to find the full remit of what we do. But essentially, as Mike said in the introduction, there are more than 1 billion people with disabilities In the world, that makes up 15% of the world's population, and one of the most disadvantaged and marginalised groups within society. In terms of youth with disabilities, we've already heard there are around 220 million youth with disabilities worldwide. Nearly 8% live in developing countries, and again, are some of the most marginalised people. How Leonard Cheshire looks at addressing our work internationally is really in three key areas. So we run programs. So internationally, we deliver inclusive education programs and economic empowerment programs. So that's really focused on supporting children with disabilities into school to learn alongside their non-disabled peers and to receive the same quality education as their non-disabled peers, and looking at pathways into employment a little bit more, which I'll talk about later in the presentation. And it's very much focused on the individual. So what does the individual want to achieve through these programs? The second area of our work, which is where my role in the organisation sits, is within the influencing team. So we look to run projects that will empower persons with disabilities to advocate for their rights, to influence change, and key decision makers to bring about policy change. So we look at working through disabled persons organisations that are present in all the countries where we operate, to look at capacity building, their role, and to look at the role of youth with disabilities within that disability movement, as well as at influencing governments and looking at the UN level as well. And the third area of our work is around research. So we have a research centre based at University College London. That is the research arm of our international work, and that's very much about building an evidence base to improve disability policy, practice and programmes. So we recognise that data around disability is really challenging and often non-existent or very weak. And our research centre really helps at looking to develop the evidence base to support the way that our programmes evolve and develop, as well as getting a better understanding of persons with disabilities and youth with disabilities in the countries where we operate. So focusing a little bit more about the influencing work that we do. So as I mentioned, I manage a project that's working with youth with disabilities to look at how we can place youth with disabilities at the centre of development. We do this through a project called 2013 Counting, which aligns the issues that youth with disabilities are telling us in their communities to the global framework of Agenda 2030 and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, as well as, so the SDGs are sort of the big global framework that we use, but the other that many of you will be aware of is the United Nations CRPD, which is also how we align our projects. We are looking at bringing together youth with disabilities across 3 countries at the moment to do advocacy work, and that's in Kenya, Philippines and Zambia. And we are training youth with disabilities alongside disabled persons organisations to lead on citizen-generated data, so to look at capturing the experiences of youth with disabilities and their peers in their community to better advocate for change within their communities. I guess the key thing to say about the project is that it's very much youth-led, so it's been the young people themselves that have decided which of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals we should focus on. And the ones that were chosen were SDG 3 around good health and well-being, SDG 4 around quality education, and SDG 8 around decent work. And so the next slide really talks a little bit about the process. So our advocacy project and the way that we're engaging youth with disabilities is in 3 phases. So the first was a centralised leadership and reporter training. That really focused on equipping youth with disabilities with skills around citizen reporting, as we're calling it, this idea of how to tell your story in a way that will make people stand up and listen, as well as sort of developing confidence and leadership potential, as well as around sort of the technology aspect of our program. The idea then that those that we train centrally will cascade the training to groups of their peers in country. So this idea of kind of making sure that we're investing in youth with disabilities and looking at the relevant skills that will be required, not just for this program, but sort of beyond the lifespan of this project as well, was really important to us. The second phase is really about how we monitor what's going on through technology. So the training sort of focused on how youth with disabilities can be using their mobile phones to report on their experiences, and really be able to capture those stories, whether it be through text message, whether it be through voice recording, or whether it be through a chat app, and be able to submit those to an online reporting hub, which will then help us collate key trends and strong stories that the youth can then be using to disseminate within their country, both on social media and at the third and final part of the project, which is advocacy events, so that the investment in the youth with disabilities, the sort of mechanisms that we're setting up to look at aligning issues in the communities to global agendas will then lead to DPOs and youth with disabilities sharing their stories and data trends with duty bearers at national advocacy events in country. And so, yeah, this is an opportunity for youth with disabilities to kind of maximise their engagement already with technology, which we know is often strong, with this idea of looking at raising your voice and being able to influence duty bearers in your country. So that's a little bit about the project that we're doing with youth with disabilities around advocacy. But youth with disabilities also factor really strongly in some of the programmatic work that we do. And I'll just briefly touch upon this before I move on to some of the key findings that have helped shape some of our programming for youth with disabilities. So to share with you a little bit about the economic empowerment program that Leonard Cheshire delivers. In developing countries, there are between 80 and 90% of working age persons with disabilities are unemployed. So the projects that we offer around sort of pathways into employment are really important. Youth with disabilities are a key target group for us, particularly within our flagship economic empowerment program called Access to Livelihoods, which is delivered in partnership with Accenture. The program supported over 18,000 people with disabilities to access waged or self-employment across India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, South Africa and the Philippines. And it has a few core elements to its programming to kind of look at how best to engage youth with disabilities into employment. One is that we have physical livelihoods resource centres in communities that persons with disabilities can go along to get advice around their career pathways, their CV, their training. We also run virtual livelihoods resource centres, so making the most and maximising technology to enable that service to have a wider reach to those in rural areas and those that persons with disabilities that may struggle to get to a physical location. We also, as a part of that programme, run a talent pathways element to the project that really sort of looks at higher skilled persons with disabilities and the additional training that can help them to really find employment that matches their abilities. So within this program, we work with a lot of youth with disabilities graduates to look at their pathways, as well as persons with disabilities that may have lost their job since acquiring a disability. So we kind of look at having a range of different approaches. I think the other thing to mention around the economic empowerment program is around mentoring, and again, this is something that came out quite strongly in some of the research that we've done around the importance of having mentors. So we have mentors from the corporate sector that look at supporting persons with disabilities and youth with disabilities that go through our economic empowerment programs that help them with the sort of preparation of their CV outside of the sort of regular training that they will receive, and will help them sit and do interview practice. And we found that's been a really important element of the program as well. So I'll move on to, so when I was asked to put the presentation together, I thought what would be most useful, what would people want to listen to, and what might be able to sort of kickstart conversations around how to best include youth with disabilities in programming. And so I put together sort of 5 key features of our programming that I think would be really useful for organisations that may or may not already be doing this. But I think the starting point for us, and in particular, you know, sort of the strand throughout the way that we work with youth with disabilities, is that involvement of youth with disabilities needs to be there from the start. I notice we have a lot of people online that already work with young people, so that a lot of this won't be too dissimilar from the ways that you already work. But I think it's really important that actually programs are youth-led, or as youth-led as they can be, to look at getting that real buy-in and empowerment for youth with disabilities to feel that they can really engage, and we've definitely found that actually the confidence and the participation of looking at how youth with disabilities can shape their experience that as organisations we are offering is really important. We see that in terms of the agenda that was set in our advocacy project, in terms of which SDGs were to be focused on. We see it as well in terms of the introductory conversations we have with youth with disabilities that attend.
This conference has reached the maximum allowable time and will be ended. All
Should I worry about, I don't know if anyone else has had a message in their ear. Should I worry about the message saying the call will end shortly? We've reached the maximum number of participants. I don't know if anyone else can hear that. I will carry on regardless and hope we don't get cut off. Yeah, this idea of looking at how youth-led programs can be has been really important for us, and making sure that those conversations are happening early.
Hey Phil, can you hear me okay? This is Sarah. Sorry to interrupt.
Hi Sarah, no,
your
I can hear you.
microphone has been turned on.
We're having some very interesting technological challenges this morning, so our apologies to everybody, and apologies to you, Phil. We're just going to check and make sure we don't get disconnected. If we do, we will try and get this back up online as quickly as possible. So just
Hello.
hey Phil.
Hi. Shall I continue?
Hi. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Do we need to start the program, or should he continue, Maria? What do you think? Yes. Yeah. Sorry, Phil. Please go ahead. We're very sorry about this. We're trying to make sure you don't get kicked out. So go ahead.
Thanks.
Right.
So yeah, so I was just talking through sort of the key features of programming for youth with disabilities.
Your microphone has been turned on.
And yeah, the first point was really around how youth-led programs can be. The second one is just it's
You
really,
have been muted.
Again, crucial for us is around providing
Your
tailored
microphone
support.
has been turned on.
Hello? Great. So I think I'm back with you. So yes, so the second area is really around providing tailored support. So we recognise that you know, within this term that we use, youth with disabilities, it makes up a huge range of persons with disabilities with all with very different needs and approaches. And actually it's kind of looking at how to put in bespoke plans in place. There's no one size fits all in terms of this. It's kind of looking at how best to tailor that support. And I recognise that can be really challenging, particularly for organisations that may not know, who will be applying for their programmes and then how to best sort of plan for that. I think certainly when all the programmes that we do, particularly the advocacy project that we're running, is open to youth with disabilities from any background, however they self-declare that disability. And for us, it's really about looking at having early conversations with them to look at their support needs, their requirements, and making sure that the adjustments can be made as early as possible and factors in as much as possible. I think the third area for us is around budget. So again, it can be really challenging to get a good grasp of actually what is the financial cost to organisations to kind of look at making adjustments. Leonard Cheshire took part in some research that was commissioned by UNICEF in partnership with a global partnership on children with disabilities recently, and this was one of the kind of top things that came up when we it was basically a youth-led research report for those that aren't familiar with it, that Youth with Disabilities led. It was a survey with organisations that ran leadership opportunities for youth with disabilities, and spoke to youth with disabilities that both were and were not part of leadership programmes in the past 12 months. Unsurprising, I guess, to everyone on the call was that sort of budget was sort of cited as a key issue in terms of preventing or kind of hindering organisations that kind of wanted to be more inclusive and look at working with youth with disabilities, but could be really challenging in terms of what the financial cost for that might be. And I think for us, I think those considerations can be happening early still. I think what was useful to come out of the research, that I think on average what we found was a good estimate is around 3 to 5% for program costs and 1 to 3% for administration costs, was kind of a useful sort of barometer to be using in terms of budgeting when it's maybe not known at the budget sort of planning stage how you might be wanting to use that budget and for which young people that you're working with, which can be a good starting point. I think another interesting thing for us that came up in the research was, and again in some of the programs that we run, particularly around economic empowerment, where we're maybe speaking to employers or potential employers, and a lot of myth busting that we have to do. So I think, yes, we recognise that there may need to be budgets set aside for inclusion, to make sure that youth with disabilities can get the opportunities of their non-disabled peers. But actually there is also a lot that can be done in terms of debunking myths around actually what is the cost, and that again what we're talking about in terms of adjustments and budget for inclusion is going to be really wide-reaching. So it may be something as simple as making a document available in a Word version format might be adequate for some youth with disabilities, whereas others it might be around the costs of personal assistance for the duration of projects, which again is a kind of completely different side of it as well. But yeah, we recognise that can be a challenge, but hopefully there are strategies to kind of look at how best to minimise the impact of that on organisations. Just a quick time check, so I'll just whiz through the final two kind of key features that I wanted to talk about. And I think that again the big one for us and Leonard Cheshire, what we're constantly looking at doing is how we can maximise digital technologies, and recognising the huge potential that this brings in terms of the demographic of youth with disabilities in particular. So For example, the youth advocacy project that we're running at the moment, we really recognise that technology can break down barriers of participation for youth with disabilities. All of the youth with disabilities that we're working with have mobile phones and are very internet savvy, and being able to kind of look at how technology can support participation of youth with disabilities, but can also influence how citizens voice their concerns and have their rights heard is something that we're wanting to maximise and is a key feature within our programming. Again, briefly, the sort of technology that we're using is kind of an online platform for youth with disabilities to submit their experiences around health, education, and employment to an online hub. They can do that with a basic phone. If you have the most bog standard phone in the world, you will still be able to participate in the program. The functionality will still allow it. If you have the top of the range smartphone, you will still be able to take part in the program. And I think, again, sort of looking at how technology can be used to create opportunities for inclusion, but again, sort of need to be thought through in terms of how that actually works in practice. And for us, kind of bringing this sort of technology element to the youth advocacy work that we do, which is a new element this year in terms of how we've been engaging youth with disabilities, has been really interesting for us, and I think has meant that we've been able to reach youth with disabilities that have access to a phone. So it doesn't need to be that they own the phone, and as long as they have access and permission from someone that has a phone, they can take part in the program. And I think again, sort of technology is running through all of the projects that we deliver, and particularly around youth with disabilities. And we know that the potential of technology is huge and is going to continue to increase, particularly in terms of our economic empowerment programs. The virtual livelihoods resource centres gives us almost limitless reach, and means that online technologies can benefit those that physically can't get to a livelihoods resource centre, and still be able to kind of access that information, the sort of skills that they need to develop, and look at sort of setting them on their career pathway. So we recognise that that's a huge area that we are investing in and wanting to look at how we can maximise to benefit our programmes. And then finally, before I stop talking and open the floor up, I think the other area that's been really important for us has been around partnerships and making sure that we're working collaboratively to look at the best ways to engage youth with disabilities. So some of the examples in terms of how we're working at the moment is working with a range of training institutions to develop more accessible vocational routes for non-academic youth with disabilities, to kind of look at making sure that exists, and sort of being able to highlight organisations and players that can bring expertise around that area has been something that's been, again, really important to developing our programmes. And this idea of myth busting with ranges of employers to kind of make sure that we can create a wider pool of employers to support stronger matches of those youth with disabilities that are coming through our economic empowerment programs. And I think the role of disabled persons organisations in each of the countries is becoming a lot more stronger within the work that we do, recognising that we have a number of different partnerships here at Leonard Cheshire, and one that we're keen to really focus on, particularly around youth with disabilities, has been sort of the disabled persons, the DPO movement in each of the countries. So we know that DPOs exist in all the countries where we work. Again, some of the research that we commissioned last year showed us that DPOs have a real role to play in communities for providing a voice for persons with disabilities on all number of levels, and we'll be working with persons with disabilities day in, day out. But actually, some of the research has shown that DPOs often lack the evidence, really strong evidence base to be able to carry out the work they do. and also that they often don't have sort of strong leadership pathways for youth with disabilities. So actually youth with disabilities are, in the research that we found, are not so strongly engaged in the work of DPOs in those countries. So again, kind of having DPO engagement and having the DPOs implement our advocacy project in the countries where we're operating has been really important because of not only looking at sort of sustainability, but also how that engagement can really bolster organisations that are operating at whether it's local, national, or global level. To look at our role as an organisation to kind of capacity build and develop those organisations in the work that we do has been really important, and partnerships, whether they're as implementing partners, whether there is in sort of advisory roles or whether they're offering mentoring opportunities. I think there's a number of ways that we can look at the roles of other organisations to kind of look holistically at how we are sort of setting up practical opportunities for youth with disabilities and really ensuring that those opportunities are maximised to their full potential. And on that note, I will say thank you for listening, I'll maybe hand back to Sarah and the team for the next phase.
Great, thanks so much, Phil. This is a great presentation. We really appreciate your insights here, which are I think really useful for us and the rest of the audience. Before we jump into Q&A, Sarah and I just had a few questions that we thought would be useful to get your insights on, and that the audience might find useful. And the first one, I'll start with one quickly. You talked about the need for flexibility and adaptation for young people with different disabilities in your programs. And you also talked about the importance of the budget and how you require funds to ensure accessibility in your programs. How do you address questions or concerns from donors when you're asking for these additional funds, whether it be this 3 to 5% or any other number that you deem important? Kind of what are some kind of challenges and advice for overcoming them when it comes to approaching donors about these issues?
Yeah, definitely, and I think it can be challenging. And it's certainly something that we find challenging as well. I think we can certainly look at previous programs and look at benchmarking in terms of what it might mean in practice. I think having a little bit of leeway, sort of looking at sort of reasonable adjustments. And again, I guess it all depends on the funder. So some might be slightly more open to that. Others, you might need to know a little bit more information before kind of putting those plans in. But I think it is a challenge. I think being able to kind of sort of have some pot of money, and I think if the principle is there and funders understand the need for kind of making that often it is around sort of the need for budget to make these adjustments happen in practice. Is something that we try to put it within sort of the narrative aspects of proposals as well, in terms of looking at kind of how budget has been used in the past, but it might not be fully known at the proposal stage exactly what you require, but we recognise that it is a challenge.
I had a quick follow-up to that question, and that's whether are you seeing overall greater buy-in among donors for this type of funding allocation for youth with disabilities? I mean, just from where you sit at Leonard, Cheshire?
I think it's quite difficult for me to answer, but I think yes. I think that certainly in the proposal that we put forward, we want to be looking at how we work with a range of persons with disabilities, again, whether it's youth with disabilities from across all spectrums, and that there will be some sort of unknown to that. I think again, it can be challenging. I mean, the example that we have in terms of the youth program that we're doing at the moment is that it's funded internally. So we've put forward some of our own seed funding so that we can get a better idea of what some of those indicative costs are, specifically related to a particular project. And so we kind of championed and wrote a business case to our finance board here, got a small amount of money to look at doing a small pilot, and we're kind of tracking that in terms of, is the budget that we've requested and put forward actually matching what it looks like in practice, and then being able to reflect at the end of that to kind of look at what would that mean in terms of a rollout and further proposals, and that's one kind of technique that we're using to sort of look at how best to get a bit more of an accurate picture around that. I think, but again, I think each funder will be very different in terms of what they might want to know at that stage, and it can be really challenging.
Thank you. I had a quick question about technology, which you referred to as a really important tool for engaging young people with disabilities and creating opportunity. And I think that's particularly interesting because we're seeing the world of work really change, and the digital economy opens up a whole array of new types of jobs and task work and digital jobs online. And at the same time, we're also seeing that this trend can create further divides and more disparity, where young people who are already barriers and demands for higher skills have a much higher wall to climb, so to speak. So it'd be great to hear more from you about how you're thinking about this opportunity and some of the challenges therein, and if you're encountering, is this trend really opening up opportunities for youth with disability, or are you still also encountering some stigma among even employers in this space, and how are you kind of thinking about that?
Yeah, no, really good question. I think certainly in terms of our economic empowerment program, the trend would be that we do sort of speak to employers that are kind of unaware of simple adaptations that can be made for persons with disabilities. But I think the kind of IT sector kind of booked that trend a little bit in terms of text-to-speak technologies, which are becoming much more prevalent, and that's something that we kind of want to look at. How can we be advocating that across more employers? I think in terms of the risks associated with technologies and making sure that it's kind of done right and it's not excluding people, again, is something that we're constantly thinking of, particularly in terms of the youth advocacy pilot that we're delivering, and thinking quite carefully about the technology that we set up. And we've gone for quite a basic sort of reporting hub type software development that will mean that a number of different types of mobile phones will be able to access and use and participate in the program, and that was again really important for us to make sure that it wasn't just sort of smartphone reliant, but actually anyone that has access to a mobile phone, whether it's the most basic mobile phone, we want to be looking at sort of engaging and giving that opportunity. And I think being able to think through those sort of practicalities of what that might look like, who might be able to access this, who might be excluded from that, again, a kind of conversations that we would be sort of having at the earliest opportunity to make sure that we don't just sort of flippantly say technology can be a really good includer, that actually it's thought through, and it's included in a way that we can have confidence in terms of who we think we might be able to reach that we weren't able to reach before.
Great, thanks a lot, Phil. So I had one more question I wanted to throw in here before we jump to questions from the audience. One issue you mentioned was you talked about applications for programs and advertising them for participants, which I think is a really important topic when it comes to youth engagement, which is kind of our focus here for this webinar, or the community of practice. How do you approach or engage with young people with disabilities through program applications or advertisements in a sensitive way that does not make them feel stigmatized or offended in any way?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of some of the projects that we've been running at the application stage, we've engaged DPOs, community organisations at a really early stage to kind of look at being an on-the-ground sort of support. for youth with disabilities that might not recognise that this programme might be for them, or that have worries or concerns, that they can actually sort of go to speak to a person or pick up the phone and speak to someone in their own country and talk that through in their local language, has been something that's been really important. I think having sort of application forms as sort of simple as possible, and in a number of different formats, whether that's just through a simple Word version format. We accept those that want to kind of cut and paste into an email, providing they're answering all the relevant questions, and being really flexible in terms of how those applications are received by us. I think the use of the Washington Group questions in terms of kind of defining what types of support needs might be required is something that we would absolutely advocate. And for those that are unfamiliar with them, again, you can go to our website and find a link to those types of questions that don't ask, do you have a disability, but look more at kind of functionality that you have as an applicant. And I think again, just having a number of different routes into information about how the application process will work and what some of the benefits of taking part might be. I think sort of all those factors are things that we sort of planned for and looked at how to address again as early as possible, and recognizing that people have different motivations, and making sure that the application forms allow space for people to kind of write in their own words, and being able to sort of pick up the phone following the application process will be really important as well. And I think making sure that we don't assume what type of adjustment might be required based on the application form alone, but that the application form is very much seen as the start of the process, and that there will be conversations to be had following that can be done to again make sure that youth with disabilities feel that this could be an opportunity for them. I think again a lot of our research really points to the idea of stigma being really a significant barrier for the youth with disabilities that we work with. A lot of the youth with disabilities that we work with kind of they say to us at the start, yes, we kind of want to fight for our rights, but no, I'm not quite sure if society will let us, because I've had this label for however ever since I can talk or whatever it might be, and sort of reinforcing it at each of the stages, just kind of how the application process and the recruitment process can be used as a way to kind of address some of those challenges. Again, is something that
great. Thanks, Phil. Those are some really great insights. I appreciate that their response, and also it's really useful that you referred us to some of these resources that people can access online. That's really useful. I think we'll definitely follow up with you afterwards, so we can send those out to the community to practice. So now we'll jump to a couple questions from the audience. One of the questions that have come through really kind of relates to some of the issues around stigma and adjusting for different disabilities that you were touching on a bit just now, and also previously in the webinar. One question is, how do you incorporate or empower young people with disabilities who are illiterate, and noting that it might be particularly difficult to incorporate illiterate youth in a program, for example, your Citizen Reporter program. Do you have any particular responses to that?
Yeah. I think the starting point for us would be kind of what are the support networks that support you already in terms of what you do? Is that about having a nominated support person that helps support you? Is it are there current ways in which you access information or express yourself that we can look at replicating through our program and having those conversations to just to sort of start a conversation about what requirements might be needed. And I think again there's an infinite number of kind of conversations that could be had around what that might look like and what is sort of reasonable within programming. But I think just sort of starting those conversations again at the early stages is something that we would recommend. I think it's difficult to have a go-to, but yeah, I think it's about trying to start that conversation and looking at whether there's other organisations that have experience supporting that particular type of disability, for example. So we kind of purposely work with national sort of focused DPOs that often tend to be umbrella bodies. So the DPOs that we work with are generally pan-disability, so they represent a number of other organisations in that country that maybe just focus on supporting those with visual impairments or those with psychosocial impairments. And I think being able to look at accessing those routes and seeing what organisations exist that might have already face these barriers and whether they have solutions to those barriers is probably the starting point.
That's great, Phil. So it sounds like one of the key points here is just kind of sitting down and thinking about who is looking to engage in your program and how you can be smart and draw on your own resources to really make the program more accessible for them. And then also that's a great tip to make sure that you're reaching out to other organizations who might have knowledge about this. We are a community of practice, so that's something we really value is learning from each other, and we're all on this together and trying to create positive impact. So I think that's something that sometimes people don't think to do, but it's great to rely on other organizations as resources to help improve your programs. That's great. So another question we have from the community here is talking about some of the adjustments that companies and businesses have had to make internally to ensure job retention. For example, what types of new competencies do supervisors and businesses need to develop in order to retain young people with disabilities and ensure they have a positive experience?
Sorry, just so I get the crux of the question, are you asking about the specific types of adjustments that need to be made?
Specifically by businesses or companies, for example, who may be involved in your economic work.
Okay. So again, it can kind of vary depending on each employer and also depending on the impairment as well. But if it's around a youth with a visual impairment, then some of the adjustments that we would be sort of supporting businesses around would be around the accessibility of materials and looking at opportunities to kind of really look at that text-to-speak technologies and trying to sort of work through and see how they could be included. I think the idea of sort of mentoring as well and sort of support for organisations in some of the early stages, both for the employer and for the person with a disability. So actually an employer that might be really well prepared, really well trained, but actually in the first few weeks comes across something that they hadn't necessarily thought about so much, and having an opportunity, whatever that might be, to kind of look at having an outlet to talk that through and to look at together with the person with disability to kind of find solutions is something that I think can ensures that you get the right outcome for whatever the particular challenge is within this particular workforce with this particular individual. And I think kind of coming at it from that angle is something that we would Absolutely. Yes.
Great, thanks, Phil. We're running out of time here, but I think we'll try to squeeze in one more question from the audience, and then I'll hand it over to Sarah to go into closing. This other question we have here is from Paul with the Visionary Network. So he is currently supporting several teams of rural Peruvian secondary school students to engage in local development challenges, drawing on their own interests and motivations. One of these teams is focused on combating discrimination against the physically disabled. Paul is wondering if, Phil, you have any ideas about how groups like this in a rural area may be able to be inspired by other examples from around the world. Some examples they might be able to look at to help support their work in combating discrimination, and kind of modify some of those examples to inspire what they're doing in their community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so one of the reasons why we kind of link the project to the SDGs is kind of making sure that it sort of has that kind of global reach, and that we know national, governments are working towards commitments, and there is specific reference to disability within the Sustainable Developments in a way that there wasn't in the Millennium Development Goals. And I think sort of having that as kind of the guiding light can be really important. And certainly for the youth with disabilities that we work with, being able to kind of, almost see themselves within, sort of global level agendas, and being helped through what can often be quite UN jargony technology, but sort of terminology, sorry. But in terms of sort of recognizing their place in that can be quite motivating in itself. I also think there are lots of really exciting projects going on at the moment. So there's certainly things that we can share that help with motivation, and particularly like WhatsApp groups. So that peer support for those that are embarking on the project, and being able to share successes as well as share challenges with their peers is something that we found really engaging. There's also a project that I was made aware of fairly recently that was commissioned by DFID, that was delivered by the University of Dundee. I forget the name of it, but I can probably share the link with you, where they were working with displaced youth, not specifically youth with disabilities, but did include youth with disabilities within that group, within sort of the Middle East and in Uganda, where participants kind of kept sort of video diaries and sort of looked at sort of recording their experiences through video in quite creative ways, and I think sort of having a range of different ways in which youth with disabilities can engage can be sort of really important. And based on the kind of video reports, there was some sort of geospatial mapping done of where these youth with disabilities and these displaced youth were in their community, and being able to kind of plot their videos on a visual map, which was I think the participants kind of enjoyed being able to share their experience, but also kind of do it in quite a creative way as well. But again, I can share links to some of those.
Thank you so much, Phil, for your remarks today, and for sharing some of the lessons you've been learning from your program. And thanks to everybody for joining and for your questions. In terms of what you can do next, we will be posting this webinar on youthpower.org, so you'll be able to access this conversation and the resources associated with Cheshire Leonard Disability. You can also, if you're interested in joining a community of practice, you can also submit a request on the Youth Power website. And if your organization has your own resources or tools focused on youth engagement and disabilities, we would love to hear from you. We do, as Mike said, we are trying to gather this type of information and share it with the wider community so that we have access to those resources. And with that, we will close out. Thank you so much again for everyone for joining, and have a great day.